Welcome back, guys, to our new transmission of our podcast, LLA, the best podcast in North America. On today's podcast, I'll be your host. My name is Antonio Medina, and today we're going to have two amazing guests. During this whole podcast and this whole transmission, we're going to be talking about different perspectives, thoughts, and we're going to give different opinions about the bystander effect. All right. Before we start with the main purpose of this podcast, I'm going to let our main guests introduce themselves. Okay, please give a round of applause for Lisa Trusoni and Andrea Aguilar.
Alright, well, I'm Lisa. I'm studying psychology at UW-Madison. I know, prestige school. I'm so proud. Yeah, I'm super excited to be a part of this podcast and share the knowledge that I've learned in my studies for this experiment.
Hi guys, I'm Andrea. I'm studying philosophy at UDEM. As well as Lisa, I'm super excited to be here, and I'm glad that you consider me for this podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure for me and for the whole community and all the people that are listening and are tuning right now to have you all as a guest. Well, as I said previously, we're going to start talking about the bystander effect. And the whole podcast will be based on a case that happened a couple of years ago. I knew that was trending topic years ago about Kitty Genovis. Okay, basically on March 13th, 1964, a 20-year-old bartender, Kitty Genovis, was murdered outside her apartment on Queens, New York. She was attacked by Winston Mosley. Basically what happened was that she was going out of her apartment to her work, when suddenly Winston Mosley came up from nowhere and stabbed her 14 times in a matter of 30 minutes. 2 weeks later went by, and the New York Times published an article, really astonished and really blowing article, where they were claiming that 38 witnesses saw the event and none of them called the police. Basically, a lot of the witnesses were saying that they watched how Mosley stabbed Kitty Genovis those 38 times, those 14 times, and in none of those times they hesitate to call the police. And it's so impressive for me right now. When I was writing this note, it was impressive for me to realize how back in the day people didn't do things. Since nowadays, the case that happened with George Floyd, lots of people, whenever that happens, saw that and were recording, and at least like how times even went by. And even though that nowadays exists 911, that is the emergency call when you see something wrong, how nowadays that doesn't matter, and how people sometimes still don't act with empathy whenever they see someone struggling. So thanks to this case that happened a couple years ago, that bystander effect was created, and it actually sparked the interest of lots of psychology. So I wanted to know the perspective of Lisa, our psychologist of today's transmission, about this case, and what does she knows about this event in particular?
Oh, Tony, before that, I actually have seen a new hashtag called Kitty Genovis, and people wanted to know with this hashtag, why do people tend to be more empathetic in larger groups? I don't know if Lisa can tell us a little bit about that.
I believe I could. This was one of our studies this week, so it's been really interesting to learn about. So there was an experiment that was done by two psychologists, John Darley and Bibb Lante, around the time that Kitty Genovis was stabbed. Because there were 38 people that did absolutely nothing while this lady was brutally murdered and raped on the street. It sparked the interest of, Tony, like you said, a whole bunch of psychologists, and they wanted to know why this happened. Like, what was going on that, no one said anything. So these two psychologists, they created this study, or they designed this experiment called the Bystander apathy effect, where they tested apathy on like different group sizes. There was like 1 person and 2 people and like 5 people. They put them all, or they put each of them like separately in a room and put headphones on them. And the headphones were, like street noises, and like you hear people talking like in a crowd, and then all of a sudden you hear like someone having a seizure, which obviously today is not something you could do, but this was what they thought was the best way to do this.
Right.
So we saw the first person got up right away and wanted to immediately go and help this person, while the other group of like 2 or 3 people, it took longer for them to stand up and do something. And when you got to the group of 5 people, like 62% of people did something. So just over half, which is crazy. But there's a whole bunch of psychology behind it, which I'm sure we'll get to later on. So was this the most ethical way to answer this question? Definitely not. But in the time that this was done, they were able to get more evidence on kind of why people tend to like stand up, or why people don't tend to stand up in larger groups. So, kind of as I said, this experiment did a lot of damage to the people that were a part of this experiment. So there was like strong psychological harm. This experiment definitely would be considered to be unethical today. Some of the psychologists can even include a risk of PTSD, and can cause like deceptive or lacks of deceptive and informed consent, because they didn't know that this was the experiment that they were going to be part of, which is another like unethical thing to do. Like if you get told you're going to be part of an experiment, like you should be told, not just brought in. So the experiment mimics both aspects of observational and naturalistic study. However, it is controlled in a laboratory, which is the control part. And that's why it makes it so unethical today to do on people. It's considered a social psychology experiment, and the psychologist suggested that the reason the apathetic phenomenon occurs in larger groups is because each witness feels responsible for helping a person in need, and the process refers to as diffusion of responsibility. So basically they feel like that someone else will stand up, and that's exactly what the other person is thinking and what the other person is thinking, and it's a whole chain. And so people will not stand up if there's some traumatic event happening. Hope that answered the question a little bit, at least.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, we were talking about this backstage, and I had more the idea about instead of just focusing, I wanted to not just focus in the psychology field, but also I wanted to focus in a philosophical, and I wanted to mix up the philosophical and psychology way, because I want to explain and focus more on the empathy aspect. Because, okay, look, according to lots of dictionaries, empathy is a word to use to describe a cognitive and emotional reaction that a human has whenever it observes an experience of another individual, and it stands out by showing her or its compassion. Basically, in psychology, this action or this attitude is described as an impulse that is commonly done with the purpose of basically assimilating others' person experience by putting themselves in their shoes, and typical expression of put yourself in the shoes of the others. So I consider that the experiment went wrong since, okay, according to a psychiatrist, called Sarah Gibbon. In 2018, she stated that humans, after reacted in an empathical way, they had on their brain they make a called empathy map. This empathy map, what it does is it considers different aspects of a situation that is subdivided in, I think it was five, I'm not wrong, five sections. That was words, sign, gestures, the body language, and the surroundings. What this psychiatrist was saying that basically whenever a human acts with empathy, what he does is that he has to see the whole context of an action. They have to be he has to see these five aspects from a situation to act in an empathical way, depending on the thoughts or the perspective or the education he received of what is considered as empathy. Because as we know, the definition of empathy or acting empathic with an empathy towards someone else is different depending on the context and depending on their context, their familiar context, the social context, and the geographical context. So basically, the thing that I think that it went wrong in this experiment is the fact that people were not able to actually perceive the actual person. They were able to hear them because, as you said, they were listening to seizures. But in reality, they were not able to perceive all of these aspects that are important. They were just able to use their word. They were just able to see the sign of the words as an aspect, or probably some just the words. They were not able to see like body language of the people, the person, or signs, or because these are common aspects that let people understand. Okay, someone is on a hurry, someone is suffering. They probably need help. So I feel that this experiment went wrong because people were just able to listen to them. And if you say in a certain fact, as you said, it was more an experiment. So people, no matter of say, most of the times whenever they feel that they're not in an actual living experience, people tend to not act with the importance that they should. So I feel like this probably the experiment went wrong, since they just made it so artificial and they didn't make it as organic as they could have been, because they could have made an experiment more in a live type situation instead of making it so systematical as an experiment, because people were isolated and they were already on a like kind of setup. So if you're already in a setup, people tend to not give the importance they could. And I feel sometimes also whenever they're in larger groups, like you were mentioning, also think that could interfere on their decisions is the pluralistic ignorance. Basically, the pluralistic ignorance is a typical aspect, or it's a concept used in psychology to refer the attitudes of people whenever they're in larger groups, whenever they're surrounded by people. Pluralistic ignorance take place because it conditions the action of others. This term is used to refer whenever people don't act, people want to act as they want according to their emotions, to according to the way they would want to, but they don't act because they feel conditioned in it, because others don't act or don't perceive things as they would do it. So since they don't want to act against people's mentalities or people's thoughts, they basically feel conditioned to act just in a certain way, and they limit themselves to act empathical towards people. And that's why I consider that the experiment went wrong, since people in larger groups, they didn't act properly, or they didn't act empathical to people, since they probably could feel conditioned because they feel like other people who, I don't know, don't want to see the events or wouldn't act the same way as they would. I feel they felt like scared about acting the way they would have wanted. So that's why I feel like this experiment in particular went wrong. I don't know what Andrea thinks about what's her position and about her point of view about this whole experiment.
Well, Tony, as you said, that thing that I think with a psychology, I mean, a philosophical point of view that went wrong, as you said, in this experiment, were the limitations that it had. There are a lot of limitations, and for example, the different layers of knowledge can be one. The cultural knowledge is varies between individuals and communities. Well, first of all, it refers like the layer refers to how the knowledge of a person has. I'm sorry. Okay. This layer refers to how the knowledge of a person has it influenced. I'm so sorry. Okay. This knowledge refers to how the knowledge of a person is influenced by the culture in which the person lives, which means that depending on the area where the person lives, the layer determines the different actions and reactions that the people may have facing this experiment. The cultural knowledge can vary between communities. For example, there's a different knowledge in people that live in cities and people that live in we may say indigenous communities. And the knowledge that each community has is very different because they have different perspectives. The technologies and the tools that they use to communicate are also very different. For example, the local knowledge is more for the indigenous communities or the communities that live far from the city, and one of them is the use of technologies. Living in a changing world of trends, people are not so aware of what is happening around them. In the society is more, and the society there is more interested in more like interest in what it will happen tomorrow than what will happen in like a week or so. And in larger cities, they are governed like more into democracy, in which an individual is free to choose in which group he or she wants to belong to. So there are many different communities within larger cities that share different knowledge, and which means that there's no sense of like union between the communities, because in like the cities they make you choose if you are in a community or if you belong to another one. So no one is really sharing knowledge between one another, or the knowledge that they share may like chocar, may
Crash.
sorry, may crash within them. So yeah, that's one point. And this affects when like helping others, as in this experiment, because there's a diversity of opinions, and the other person may differ from your from your beliefs. I'm sorry, for your beliefs or your taste of your ideology, and therefore there's an uncertainty that I think it's another limitation, the uncertainty of when you should act according to what you know. And viewing it from the on the other hand, if we remove all of the changing world that we live in and we keep that local knowledge, everything changes. Here the technologies does not play such an important role in a day life. Daily life is governed by like the society, from interaction, from its environment, and according to the UNESCO, this makes within the indigenous community. And according to the UNESCO, in the indigenous community, they are more likely to help one another, since there is an empathy due to the culture that they know, due to the union that they have, because the culture is greater. Because the culture has more sense of health than in larger cities. So to sum this up, I think that they like the knowledge depends. The cultural knowledge will determine the actions that people may have according to an event. And in this case, there's a very different point of view for help within larger and in smaller communities.
Yeah, definitely. And something that was pointed out that you just said was the fact of the geographical context that actually influences in people's mindset. Because I was actually seeing that it's always been proven, but it's impressive for me to acknowledge the fact of how, for example, Mexicans tend to be more. It's gonna sound, it's a term used in Mexico, but more raza people. So we're more like con la raza, con la gente. We like to be friendly. We like to be, we like to be talkative. We like to be like hanging around with people. We like to be tight with each other. We're super friendly. That's the stereotypical thing about Mexicans, and it's actually true. I'm not gonna lie. So we're super fiesteros. Todos son nuestros amigos. But in comparison with German people, in Germany, people are cold as hell. Everyone is super cold. They're not super expressive. Everybody minds in their own business. So I feel that actually also influences in how people react in when it comes to empathy or sympathy also, because people tend to misunderstand and have different, like they used to come to confuse the actual meaning of empathy with sympathy, when in reality sympathy is nothing like empathy. Empathy is actually putting yourself in the shoes with others, but sympathy actually is just being like kind of acknowledging what the people is doing, but not actually doing something to help her out. Basically, empathy is whenever you're actually acknowledging and doing something to help him or her out, because you do understand what she's going through and you are acting to help her out. When in sympathy, you just acknowledge what's going on, but you just want to be sympathetic to him or her, but you're not actually acting or doing something to help her out. So what you just said, I feel like also the geographical context is something that also could go wrong on this experiment. Since they're just experimenting in general, like in the experiment, they're not specifying what kind of people are the ones we're getting experimented to. So, for example, probably you will have different results if the geographical, if the context of geographical people of the experiment was different. Because as I just stated, we already know that, for example, in Germany, the cultural in general is to be cold and to just minding your own business. When in difference in Mexico, I feel like Mexicans are completely different. They tend to involve with other people's businesses, and in occasions they mind in people's businesses, but at least sometimes they react to help them out. So I feel like the cultural clashes in different cultures can also influence on how they react in the measurement they take, depending on the occasion it happens. I don't know what Lisa would say about this, or what her opinion about this topic in general.
I think you made a really good point and like really emphasized like the cultural like differences. Like for example, I grew up in like Lake Country area, which is like very like high class or like high middle class, and like there's all the moms and like the yoga pants and t-shirts, like going out for like their morning brunch with like their group of friends. And so that's like the cultural like norm, whereas like you go out to some place like, I'm using Wisconsin examples, but you go to like Milwaukee and it is so different. Like Milwaukee, you're taught to like keep your head down and like keep walking and like not pay mind to anybody and like mind your own business and kind of like focus on your path. Whereas like when you grow up and it's more like Lake Country, everybody's business is your business, and everybody's like putting their nose up in their neighbor's business, and sometimes like it's not right, but like that's the environment like you grow up in. Yeah, I think definitely like where you grew up, your environment, like rural versus urban areas, like they all have their different values and different, like ways of life.
Yeah, that is very true.
Also, another thing that we could point out is probably when it comes to the diffusion of responsibility, as you all guys pointed out, I sometimes feel like people tend to not just care about what others think because they feel like there's no responsibility. The thought of if it's not bothering me, I won't get involved with that. And I think also it comes out with the when it comes to the people's responsibility feeling of or the diffusion of. So people tend to, they're depending on the people or how they were educated. People they just tend to, as you all say, minding their own business. So I feel like that's also like, as we already said, that's probably the main characteristic of the problem that happened in this occasion in this experiment. This could be a variant or a reason why this whole experiment went wrong. The fact that people do just mind in their own criteria, their responsibility, because they feel it's not responsibility of them to act after that, after that decision or after that conflict. I can see that could be probably the reason of why people could just mind in their business and act towards certain actions or settings. So, well, we're running out of time, so I feel like we should start making the conclusion for today's podcast. So basically,
All right, guys, we're back. So we ended off on a really great conversation between Tony and Andrea about like our environment and how that affects like our upbringing and everything. So back to kind of our traumatic event. So this whole experiment actually like really messed people up like psychologically. There were things that actually happened like in their brain and in anybody's brain when they experience trauma. So I guess our question is what happens in the brain and like how does witnessing a traumatic event influence the brain? So the first thing that happens, it's not really like the first, but one of the things that happens is neurochemicals are like rushed to the brain that like create a picture. So you're kind of like getting the moment that traumatic event happened, you're getting like the image of it, and then which is known as a memory. And so like you kind of have that memory like looping over and over in your head, and eventually it switches like from the emotional side, or like it disconnects from that side, or no, sorry, it moves over to the emotional side and disconnects from like the logical and like reasoning and processing part of your brain. So like an example is, you see a man like being aggressive like toward his wife in public. Your mind like doesn't immediately go like, oh, I need to help this woman. Like honestly, your mind goes like, wow, I'm glad that's not me getting abused by my boyfriend or my husband, which like sounds really selfish, and it's like, wow, we really should like be caring about this woman. Scientifically, like we don't. Like we have survival instincts, and our survival instincts only influence us. So you fear getting hurt, and so like you think it's better to do nothing than to risk your own life. So that's kind of the basic explanation, but there's like so much more that happens that goes on. One thing that happens is your amygdala enlarges, and that's what triggers that like fight or flight mode. The hippocampus is responsible for the short-term memory, which shrinks, and it kind of goes into the long-term memory. The prefrontal cortex also shrinks, making it harder to like regulate any emotion and thought. And depending on how traumatic the event is, like even just witnessing it, you can suffer from PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be, triggered like in the moment or years later, like after experiencing the event. So the person may get stuck. Like another like psychological process is a person may get stuck in like a negative thought process and just not be able to like get out of that. They may have difficulty expressing like thoughts and feelings, like how the event made them feel and all that. And they may be stuck in, the like, I didn't like, this that happened, or like kind of that like one statement that defines that event. And like a severe case, witnessing a traumatic event, the body can teach you to see trauma everywhere. Like, your fight or flight mode is on all the time and making it impossible, to like function even, on a daily basis. And each of these things, can be unpacked, but there's not nearly enough time, for this podcast. And we're actually running out of time. So, talking, in the most severe case, your body and brain can suffer immensely. And the worst thing is, it wasn't even your fault, and yet you're taking this major hit, which is not, a great feeling. So, as mentioned, we are out of time for this podcast. But we wanted to, share or come on the air and bring awareness of empathy and of this bystander effect, and just for you to get more knowledge, and maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't. That's all right, either one. Yeah, like, thanks for joining in, Andrea, Tony.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, basically, I just like to say the main reason, the main purpose of this main podcast is probably not convincing all the people to actually, from today on, be empathetic and always be the greatest human in the world. But the important thing is to always, I think it's not important to have like a big crowd who change, but at least one of all the people who listen to us at least learn something. That's the most important special thing about having a podcast now. So basically, I appreciate all the point of views, ideas, and all the things that Andrea and Lisa shared today. We feel honored to have you guys as our guests. And basically, on today's transmission, we just wanted to share, as always, our main mission, that is spreading love, peace, and positivity to our people, the people that live in this earth, and to try to persuade you to be a better person. Because being better, being empathic, and being a good human being, it doesn't cost you a thing. It doesn't cost $1,000. It doesn't need you to make a whole transaction of $1 million. You'd have to be a billionaire to be a good person. You just have to be willing to stand up and to be that little percentage of people who wants to make a change in this world and make it a better place. Just like Michael Jackson says, or just like the Black Eyed Peas says, it's spreading the love. Because people, where's the love nowadays? Well, I've seen lots of things going on, and people just stop having that humanized values and things that make us a human and reunites us as a good community. So basically, I hope you all listeners have a great day. Take care of you all. See you in the next time, and peace out. Peace.